10 months ago, a Vietnamese fishing trawler legally operating in the South China Sea Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, is seized by the People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, and towed to the Chinese port of Haikou on Hainan Island, where the captain is put on trial and the crew jailed. Vietnam vehemently protests the Chinese actions, claiming the vessel is operating well within Vietnam's 200 nautical mile EEZ, and takes the matter to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the UN. ASEAN passes a resolution impugning the Chinese action, calling for the release of the ship and crew. The UN is unable to pass a US-sponsored resolution due to the threatened vetoes of China and Russia. 8 months ago, the Philippine government awards oil exploration contracts to the Gujarat State Petroleum Corporation Limited, an India state-owned corporation, for exploration of South China Sea blocks within the Philippine EEZ beginning by the next summer. 7 months ago, the Philippine challenge to China's South China Sea claims brought before the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, tribunal by the Aquino government, continues to languish without action, as China continues to refuse to acknowledge it. 6 months ago, the United States Secretary of Defense announces that the annual Malabar naval exercise will take place in the Andaman Sea beginning the last week of August. This joint U.S.-Indian 10-day exercise will include participants from Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Forces. For the first time, it will also include participants from Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippine navies, making it the largest exercise of the series. 3 months ago, Beijing increases naval patrols within the South China Sea, especially in the disputed areas. Vietnam and the Philippines both respond in kind. By late July, ships from both countries cross paths with PLAN warships, are queried by them, and closely shadowed. For the third time in 4 years, the annual ASEAN Summit fails to produce a joint statement regarding the South China Sea situation. The foreign ministers of Vietnam and the Philippines are particularly upset at the inability of the other ASEAN members to address serious problems within the region, specifically the inability to hold China accountable for its actions. Vietnamese and Chinese patrol craft trade warning shots off of the Vietnamese coast just east of Julia Shoal. No injuries are reported, but Hanoi sends a formal protest to Beijing. Hanoi had been expected to raise the issue within ASEAN as part of normal recourse, but decides not to do so. Instead, the foreign ministry releases a statement that in part reads, "There is little point in addressing this situation within an organization that is not empowered to take significant action." 2 months ago, Joint Exercise Malabar 24 begins in the Andaman Sea. 1 month ago, near Half Moon Shoal, during rough weather, 2 Chinese Coast Guard vessels attempting to chase off an Indian oil exploration vessel are confronted by 2 Philippine patrol craft assigned to protect the Indian vessel. As the vessels maneuver for position, one of the Chinese ships fires on the Indian vessel, causing significant damage. Both Philippine patrol vessels return fire and are subsequently fired on and sunk by the Chinese vessels. The Chinese ships, also sustaining damage, withdraw from the area. The attack results in the death of 5 and the wounding of 4 on the Indian vessel, and the loss of almost all on board both Philippine patrol ships, with the death of 95 of the 116 crewmen and the remainder rescued. As the news and survivor accounts of the incident spread, there are significant anti-Chinese protests in Manila and New Delhi. At first, the Chinese government denies the incident took place. However, as the news reports begin to focus on the dead and the accounts of the wounded, Beijing places the blame on the Philippines for, quote, its blatant conduct of illegal actions within Chinese territory, end quote, as the direct cause of the loss of life. Weekend-long anti-Chinese protests spread across India and the Philippines. In New Delhi, protesters attacked the Chinese embassy and several local Chinese-owned businesses. Philippine and Indian legislators rail against Chinese aggression, sentiments that are echoed in the press and opinion polls. News commentators in India bemoan the weakness of the government's response and buttress growing public anger and increasing demands for credible action, not simply continued talk. Due to the South China Sea incident and the immediate desire of the Philippine and Vietnamese governments to return their exercise forces, the decision is made to terminate the Malabar exercise. As part of the return of amphibious forces, A freedom of navigation exercise is staged through the South China Sea. India decides to send its vessels to the Philippine naval base at Balabac Island, located at the southern end of Palawan and just off the South China Sea, in order to escort the oil exploration vessel back to India once repaired. As part of the freedom of navigation exercise, US and Japanese ships will steam with the other ships into the South China Sea, and as the Vietnamese, Philippine, and Indian naval vessels detach to return to their ports, the Japanese and US ships will proceed through the South China Sea, exiting at the northern end through the Bashi Channel, just south of Taiwan. The Japanese ships will then steam on to their home ports, and the US ships will sail into the Philippine Sea and conduct a series of calls to eastern Philippine ports. The passage occurs without incident. Simultaneous to this, the governments of Vietnam and the Philippines appeal to the United Nations Security Council through the United States, not to condemn China as most had expected, but to propose the creation of formal talks in order to broker a resolution of the South China Sea claims. Today, negotiation teams from the governments of China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, India, Japan, and the United States, along with the UN Special Representative, are gathered in Jakarta, Indonesia, to begin negotiations in an effort to move toward a resolution of the South China Sea situation. Each team arrives with a set of confidential instructions containing the negotiating positions of their governments.